Ian, we've got 15 minutes, Matthew just said, to solve all the, yeah, exactly, I had the same problem, to solve all the diversity and supply issues. But first question, Ian Levy, Technical Director of NCSC, doesn't have anything to do with your ability to take your mask off. I understand that. But what's that mean? What do you do, and why do you care? Why are you here?
So now I have finally taken my mask off. That wasn't at all embarrassing. Nobody noticed, right? So NCSC is the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK. So we're with the government agency, the single government agency that's responsible for cybersecurity for the whole of the UK. So everything from top secret military intelligence stuff down through central government, local government, critically for this, critical infrastructure, including telecoms, but then down to the citizen, small business, big business, and everybody else. So we're here to make the UK the safest place to live and work online.
So let's pick up on that, since there's a few people out here who care a little bit about telecom networks, and in particular 5G networks. The session that preceded this, I wrote down two quotes. One by Onan Oswal of Palo Alto, who said, 5G is transformative only if it's secure. And then another one from Bob Lyle of SpyCloud, who said that in a survey of the 21 verticals making up the Fortune 1000, telecom was the worst performing in terms of security. Discuss.
So for those that don't know me, I have a habit of being a bit blunt, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody. My experience, telecom security is garbage. Has been for 20 years. We have a security model that was set up in the 1980s, and we are absolutely hanging on to it. We've had to change the incentives in the UK from regulation because nobody buys secure telecoms. Right, okay, so a group of interested security people in the audience. Audience participation time, people. Hands up if you have home broadband. God, I dare anybody not to put their hand up. Right, keep your hand up if you bought your home broadband because of the security of the MPLS PE node. Right, nobody, not even me. You buy your home broadband based on Netflix, free or not, right? So there's no incentive for people, for operators to differentiate on security because nobody buys it. So there's no incentive for vendors to include security in their products. That's a regulatory problem. Today, actually, we just published a code of practice in the UK for our new regulatory system for consultation about how operators have to build and run their networks, and also how vendors have to include security. So we're getting serious about this, trying to fundamentally change the security model for modern telecoms networks.
So you just talked about hardware and the Wi-Fi routers, in essence. We're talking, it's the access point to the network. We need to have security there, clearly. But in the network per se, all right, we're living in a world now where, thanks to 5G, the network is virtualized. It's out there. And how do we secure something that is as distributed and digital and virtualized as the network is now?
So I think there's a whole bunch of security misunderstandings around 5G. So we talk about edge compute, and we talk about small cells, and we talk about all these things, and we talk about virtualization. And if you think about them in the wrong way, you end up going, well, hang on, my core network is in every single box. That cannot be true, right? If you think about a small cells architecture, in the UK, I'm going to have small cells on lampposts and bus stops. If those cells, those small cells, have core functionality in them, and that can be leveraged to attack the main network, then my network is as secure as somebody not climbing up a lamppost, which isn't a good security model. Right? If that's your security model, you've built it wrong. So we've got to come back from the hype and talk about the details. Details really matter in this. Virtualization, for me, is a real security positive for 5G, because we're taking telco from this ancient 1980s security model and bringing it towards the internet model of security. And let's be honest, right? And again, I don't mean to offend anybody, 5G is internet with aerials, right? That's really all it is. As we start to move towards modern technologies, modern architectures, we can leverage the security learnings we've got from running hyperscale internet to actually do something really cool. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Virtualization is part of that. I don't think it's a threat.
So there is lots of discussion, and it's in the topic here that we're talking about now, lots of discussion that security and diversification are, if not synonymous, at least first cousins. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely agree. For us, I think my mic wasn't on, I absolutely agree with that. So for us, we did, as part of our regulatory change, we did a real ground-up security analysis of telecoms networks. So how do you attack a telecoms network? Because as far as I know, nobody's done it before. And we ended up with 140-something different ways of attacking. There's things like, I'm going to use credentials to access management plane and do blah, blah, blah. One of them is, I'm going to remove support. And so if you look at the actual countries in the world, almost all of them are nationally dependent on someone else. So we are nationally dependent on Nokia and Ericsson. And so I have to fix that. If Nokia and Ericsson, much as I love them, if they have a problem, I have real problems in the UK. Now, with our move to remove Huawei from our 5G networks, we're down to just Nokia and Ericsson. I can't actually make the UK resilient with only 2 vendors. I need 3. And 3 is not a very comfortable number. If I need a minimum of 3, I'd like 4, 5, or 6. So I've got some national resilience. So for me, even at just the most basic level, before you get into the technology, in order to have a resilient and secure network, you have to have vendor diversity.
But you keep using the word network, singular, okay? We're talking about where we're in a virtualized environment where there's N+1 networks that are out there right now, or they're going to be out there running on 5G. How do you provide security across that vast scope of differentiated suppliers?
So there's a thing for me about how we build networks. So where do you put trust, right? So I've not met most people, right? But you can trust me, I'm a doctor, right? I build the best 5G base station on the planet, or the best VNF on the planet, right? It's perfect. Hands up if you believe me. Okay. When Scott talks later, you really shouldn't listen to him. It's bad judgment. What's it going to take for me to convince you? What do you want? Shall I give you my source code? Shall I show you my devs? What do you want me to do to convince you? In the end, it's facile. Right? So saying I trust this piece of equipment never to have a fault is an insane security model. So we need to start building networks that are tolerant to faults, tolerant to exploitation, so that a single exploitation, a single vulnerability in a network is no longer the end of that network. That is not a sensible design criteria. That's what we're trying to do with our new regulation. It's going to take years to get there, but building networks in a completely different way, so I can put appropriate trust in appropriate places, but the network itself, and however many networks you want, Tom, the networks themselves actually have an emergent property that is security.
Okay, but but the reality is that people build networks to make money and hopefully at a profit, all right? You're now talking about 140 pages, you said 140 pages of specifications to provide security to the network at a time when the networks are increasingly competitively challenged by new entrants building private networks for enterprises, etc. And you're expecting the people whose revenue is being cannibalized to invest more to provide security for everyone. What's wrong with this picture, Ian?
So, again, let's make sure everybody knows who everybody is, right? I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Scariest 9 words on the planet. So, I totally get that the revenue model for operators is changing, right? The high-value consumer services are being disintermediated by others. But this new technology could bring new value streams. I don't think it's going to be fundamentally different, but I think they are going to start making money again. Is there a place for government to change how we work with the operators? Probably. And what we're trying to do with the security stuff is take away optionality and take away risk. So at the moment, well, previously, we used to go to operators and go, you should all care about security. Go on, care. Care some more. You haven't cared enough, go and care a bit more. That's, how do you cost that as a business? How do you understand your regulatory risk? So we've changed that and we've said, this is the minimum standard. You can meet it any way you want. If you don't understand how to meet it, do this. But these are the minimum standards, and here's how we're going to test them. So we're taking away risk for them from the security side. Over time, I hope that the security stuff basically blends into their standard operations. They become secure organizations. It's not a differentiated line on their P&L. So I think there is a real change in approach for the businesses that are operators today that become much more security conscious, much more security aware, and it just becomes part of their DNA.
Becomes part of their DNA so long as they can have a successful business model operating. So the fascinating thing is, in our country, when we tried to deal with the question of how do we provide universal service, we turned around and we said, okay, we're going to create a fund and share it across operators, because the idea of everybody being able to connect is important. If the government is stepping in and saying, here's 140 pages of rules that I'm going to keep banging you on that. I'm an old rule maker too, right? But if there's 140 pages of rules that you have to follow that is going to have an impact, is there a concomitant responsibility on the part of the government to say, and here's how we're going to help you pay for that?
So, again, I'm not a regulator, and I'm not a policy department, so I can sit here and go, yes, we probably should do that, but it's not my fault. What I can do is make sure that we give the right guidance, the right tools, and the right help to those operators to make them secure. And if you think about it, it's actually in all of our interests for them to do the basics really well. Right? Because if they don't, cyber Darwinism is going to take over at some point. Right? So, Darwinism works in the real world. It probably works in the cybersecurity realm as well. If you don't do the basics of cybersecurity well, you're not going to be around very long. This is becoming a big differentiator in terms of how you run your business. Now, does government do things that drive value out of that sector? Yeah, absolutely. And should we change that? Probably. But I don't think security is the killer for that. You've got things like spectrum auctions. You've got things like regulatory requirements. You've got things like universal service. And those things are not universally compatible with each other.
So one last question here as we wrap up. As we walk through the hall here, all of the pillars have AWS wrapped around them. Yep. We're sitting here talking about traditional networks, new enterprise private networks, all of which are ending up in the cloud, right? No, you're not. You're rolling your eyes. You're unwilling to stipulate to that?
I am unwilling to agree to that right now. They are going to end up in...
That are going to be, okay, let's go. That in a virtualized world are going to end up in the cloud.
They're going to end up in a virtualization fabric. It may or may not be AWS, it may or may not be Google, it may or not be Microsoft, it might be sat in the telco, it might be a national one, but sure.
But it'll be going to a cloud that'll be run by somebody. I'm not plugging AWS here, okay? But what is the responsibility of a cloud, of those who are offering cloud services? And how do they fit into this supply chain issue that you're raising here?
So you leave the question with the 25-minute answer to the end. It's brilliant. So really quickly...
We're going to hold the stage.
No, we're not. Really quickly, the issue around cloud is shared responsibility. So there's kind of an axiomatic set of responsibilities that have to be satisfied. And what we're trying to do with the cloud providers is go, here's the basic set that you do, here's the basic set the operators do, and there's some grey area in the middle that we have to work through. The thing that's really important is enumerating those axiomatic set of responsibilities. And again, that's part of the thing we've done with our new regulation, is to lay those out to the best of our ability, that says these are the things that have to happen. And as long as they happen in a consistent way, we're cool. And whether it happens with AWS doing it, or BT doing it, or me doing it, it doesn't really matter, as long as they're done consistently across the network and the service. So that's how we're trying to approach this. What I don't want to do is say cloud is the answer, because in 5 years, it'll be something else.
And therefore, you're setting standards for the cloud as well. And Matthew is going to the podium, and I think that's a subtle hint for you and me.
Really subtle.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian and Tom, for that fantastic introduction, which our panel will now discuss. If the panel could come up and take their seats, and I will introduce you while you do. We have Pierce O'Donoghue, who is Director of Communications Networks, Content and Technology at the European Commission. We have Scott Bailey, who's Director for Telecoms Diversification at the UK Digital Department. We have Diane Rinaldo, who's Executive Director of the Open RAN Policy Coalition, and Jaisha Ray, who's Associate Administrator for International Affairs at NTIA in the US Department of Commerce. So perhaps I could come to each of you in turn, and maybe let's start at the far end with Scott, just for a very quick reaction to what we heard from Tom and Ian there.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matthew. I sat on this end thinking you'd come to me last, so that's already a failure. Also, I got a promotion. I'm actually only a deputy director. Just to say thank you, I'm delighted to be on the panel. I was going to talk about two things. One was why the UK government thinks that supply chain diversification is an integral part of the wider security of our critical national infrastructure. But actually, Ian covered all of that. And then I was going to talk about why we think it requires a particular set of responses that are different to, but are kind of good companions to all the other things that we're doing on telecom security. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about that, because I think we kind of talked about why there's a problem, but a bit less about what we do about it. And I think in the UK, we've got a really clear plan and a strategy about what we want to do. It's based on three key pillars. The first is, as Ian says, we've only got 2 vendors left in our network, Nokia and Ericsson. We need to work really closely with them to understand their position, to make sure that we understand any issues with their supply chains, to kind of understand the health of the company. And then critically, to make sure that we're kind of aligning where we can with them on the future that we want to get to, because there's no world in which Nokia and Ericsson aren't going to continue to be major suppliers into UK networks. The second strand of our work is around how we attract new scale vendors into the UK market in the short to medium term. There's obviously not many choices for us. I mean, the reason we're all here is because there is a lack of telecoms diversity of supply. And so, you know, when the UK looks around the world at the moment and is trying to find a new scale vendor as Huawei exits the market, there's not many companies that we can turn to. But we're looking at things that we can do in the regulatory and the policy and the commercial space to reduce some of the barriers to new vendors coming into the UK market. And then the final strand of our work and of our sort of particular set of responses related to telecoms diversification is how we bring forward new, open and interoperable technologies. Everyone at Mobile World Congress is talking about Open RAN, but there's a number. They offer, for us, the potential for new vendors to come in. Ian's talked about all of the benefits that we think that gives. And we think there's a real role for governments working together, for regulators, for policy people to share knowledge, to look to accelerate the development of the research, to look to accelerate research and development, to see how we can embed the right approaches and standards. And that's what we're doing. We're doing right now. We've announced £250 million to spend on that, and it's what I spend a lot of my time talking to industry and to other governments about.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. I think the first thing that I would reflect on the very interesting chat that we heard was, of course, that telco security, telecom security, network security is far from what the cybersecurity experts would want it, and certainly what governments and policymakers would want as well. And therefore, as we evolve towards a much more diversified and open network architecture in the future, we can't introduce and force feed new concepts until we are absolutely sure about the security. So let me say what my role is. My role is to ensure the rapid rollout of 5G in Europe. for industry and for users, for the good of the economy, for the good of society. Many telcos are already heavily engaged in that investment, and quite frankly, some of the discussion about Open RAN is distracting that immediate task, and in a way that I don't think is necessary, because clearly when we talk about Open RAN, we are talking about something that is going to evolve as the technology evolves. But already, with our member states, for example, we have just completed and have an initial draft of a security assessment of the implications of Open RAN, which we'll be finalizing and hopefully releasing later this year. But I have to say, we see the writing on the wall. So we have to be clear that when we do have this diversity, that it does actually increase security as well as security of supply. So that is a major challenge for us. And therefore, in developing new ways of our architecture for the network, we should not throw out the systems that have worked, even if they are flawed to a certain extent. And what I mean there particularly is in standard setting. We appear to be putting our faith in an unidentified, unstable, and actually incompatible standardization process, which pushes to one side certain players to the advantage of others in a way that was never the case, for example, in the 3GPP. So we will have grave concerns if it were to be the situation that we tried to do all this in a forum which is not even WTO compatible, but that in embracing the opening of architectures, the opening of networks, remember that there are already scores of suppliers for core components and for RAN components, and clearly the future is theirs, and that's something which we need to do safely and securely along well-established procedures.
Thank you, Piers. Diane.
Just like Anna, I'm all tangled up as well. I will just leave it. Sorry. Well, thank you for including me, and it's good to be here today. Security is not an endpoint, it's a constant. We need to constantly remain vigilant. We need to work with our partners, whether it be our partners in industry or our partners with government, to ensure that we're constantly moving the ball forward, including the latest and newest technologies to ensure that we remain secure. For Open RAN, we're not talking about a technology. I'm not evangelizing one technology that we should all move towards. It's about opening the architecture and allowing, as Piers mentioned, those subcomponents, which drives competition and innovation, which is going to lead to greater security. You know, future-proof is a catchphrase right now that everyone's using, and it fits perfectly with the conversation around Open RAN. It allows for us to be nimble and to update networks going forward, and it's really going to change the way we look at the Gs moving forward. So I appreciate events like this that can raise issues around these conversations and figure out how we can all come together to ensure that we are meeting the highest standards when it comes to security of our networks.
Thank you, Diane.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Well, the masks are a challenge. All right. I will just start out by saying I do agree with Ian on the resiliency.
Do you want me to help you?
Yeah. The resiliency and the supply chain. I don't know what I did. Supply chain resiliency being a top concern, and that is why the U.S. government has just been so sorry.
Can you say partnership?
Oh my God. Well, thank you. The U.S. government has been working very closely with industry on this push towards Open RAN, and we're seeing so much momentum from industry and agree that the effort can and should be industry-led. But there is a role for governments here. And so, like the UK, the United States has been actively engaged within our own system, looking to develop 5G labs to test Open RAN, looking at investments. And we are also extremely focused on the international cooperation that will be critical to ensure that these technologies can come to light. Obviously, security is a key concern. But we are seeing at the early stages some security benefits. We'll continue to study the security issues in close partnership with our allies. But that does not mean we should delay our efforts to enable these technologies. We just need to work to ensure security is embedded within.
Thank you very much, Jaysha. Thank you all. So, out of your reactions and out of that earlier discussion between Tom and Ian, let me put out sort of three themes that have been there. One is, Piers, you talked about the need to get 5G out there. Let's get the benefits of it, and that is clearly going to be built on what we have now. Ian and Tom were talking about resilience and security through diversification, and obviously Open RAN is an example of diversification in the supply chain. You could either see these things as in opposition to each other, or you could see them as complementary, as part of an evolution. So I wanted to ask whether any of you wants to pick that up. Is this an evolution? Are we seeing a new direction built on what we've got, or is this actually more of a revolution and more of a sort of systemic change? Any views? Piers, you're.
I think that what we have detected at some points in the discussion is that there is an industrial policy objective hiding behind the discussion about Open RAN, for example. And that is necessary. It's necessary to decouple whether we're favouring one or other operator. Let me start by saying, and we've just in another room launched our 6G joint undertaking for research and innovation in 6G. It is clear that we are moving towards completely virtualized networks, which will embrace and actually facilitate this much more open architecture that has been talked about. But in the meantime, I don't think it is realistic to expect, for example, operators who have been forced to rip and replace parts of their 4G network. Now, if Open RAN had been mature 2 years ago, maybe we'd be having a very different discussion, but it is not the case. And also, as we've seen, that 5G in its first instances is very much non-standalone. It's based entirely on the 4G network. And that evolution towards standalone is something which we are trying to push, but which cannot wait for Open RAN. It can already incorporate a wider number of sub-vendors for sub-components. And the last point I'll make is where I would have thought a lot of the focus now should be is on Cloud RAN, because that is the new kid on the block, and that is where there's a lot of evolution, as we see, and where there is already space for new vendors to come in and to play an important part in the development of Cloud RAN.
Scott.
So, firstly, I mean, I think we can say this from the UK because it's fair to say we don't have any skin in the game here. Like, there isn't an industrial policy angle for us. We sort of aren't starting from that perspective. So I think from the UK's perspective, we're absolutely clear this is about security and resilience. And I'm going to give a kind of very civil servant answer to your question. Can I say it's sort of evolution with revolutionary elements? Because I think what I mean is I think for us, there is this trend, you know, Ian and Tom talked about softwareization, virtualization. I think that is a trend that we're seeing across industry that is kind of leading to a lot, or creating opportunities for a lot of these things to happen. But I think it's a revolution in the sense that perhaps for the first time, because of this alignment of industry and kind of government interest, there's a genuine opportunity to kind of make it happen and make it stick. And that for us is the kind of critical thing. We want to do it in a way that's embedded. Piers mentioned standards. It's really critical that we do this in a way that is meaningful. And for me, that's probably the revolution. It's something that we need to kind of make happen and then make it permanent.
Sure.
Yep.
So I'm going to agree with Scott that it is both. And from a U.S. perspective, we are completely supportive of the incumbent suppliers. And we're just so pleased to hear a senior leader from Nokia just say very recently that Open RAN is unstoppable. And they're embracing the Open RAN approach. And so there's evolution from our incumbents, but the revolution is the innovation involved with the new companies that are springing up around the world. And so also agreeing for the United States, it is not industrial policy. It is indeed supply chain resiliency and cost and market competition.
Yes, and just to, I agree. We are in the midst of an evolution based on a revolution of how we look at computing networks, led by virtualization, led by AI and machine learning. I would say that as we are a global organization, we represent companies around the globe, and it is just so heartening to talk to companies. Like last week, I talked to a vendor in South Africa that's interested in joining because they see opportunities where none existed before. For 20 years, there's been so little venture capital money in this space because if you had a great idea, you only had a handful of opportunities, a handful of companies to sell to. But now that we are opening up the architecture, you can go directly to a carrier, you can go directly to a private network. It's really opening the aperture how we look at the telco ecosystem, and it's really going to allow for that, again, that future-proofing of networks as we move forward and allow for updating and integrating as we move along.
So, thank you. You've all talked in different ways about the increasing cloudification of the network, the increasing software-defined network quality. So I had another question, which was to what extent is part of the answer here a potential separation of the hardware and software markets? If what we're looking for is a supply chain that's more diverse, that has more actors in it, and where you lower the barriers to entry into the supply chain, into an industry which is famously resource-heavy in R&D, is breaking it up between hardware and software part of the answer? Does anyone want to pick that one up?
You want to go?
Diane.
So I would just say it's the evolution of how we move forward and allowing carriers and network operators the flexibility to build the networks that best suit their needs. I mean, the networks that you build in New York City are going to look a lot different than the networks you build in a more rural part of the world. And so we need to ensure that as we move along, they do have that flexibility and can build those dynamic networks that suit their needs.
Yes, please.
Thank you. From what we're being told by the experts, and here we rely on our experts, certainly I'm no expert, we will see increasing dependency on software. But to separate them, I'm not sure when software will increasingly control the hardware. And when we again talk about the security piece, it's the coding, it's the firmware, and then of course all of the application software that's running in the network, whether it's in the RAN or in the core, that are the most sensitive areas in terms of attack. So that is where the focus will have to be. But in fact, I've even heard it said here yesterday that software will be the infrastructure. Now, that's the way that you will have to look at advanced 5G networks. So I'm not quite sure. It might be a neat legal approach, but I'm not sure it's going to work with the engineers.
So, moving on from that, Piers, I had a question particularly for you, because Ian and Tom were talking about the 140 pages of guidance to network operators, the minimum standards, that kind of thing. In the EU, you've adopted a possibly slightly different approach with the 5G toolkit. Could you say a word about how that works and how that, in Ian's words, helps the operators to deliver the resilience you're looking for?
We must remember that in the European Union, national security, the security of critical infrastructures is still very much what we call a competence. It's the power of the member states. That's the way in which the European Union is constructed. So when all of the member states came together and actually asked the Commission to coordinate in what became the 5G toolbox, it was on the understanding that we were giving this toolbox, but which would then have legal or regulatory force at the level of the member states, who could pick the most appropriate mechanisms for them, given their network topography, what was simply the history, and of course in some cases their own security analysis, their risk analysis, although that complemented, because they did actually all submit, and we put together those risk analyses in a confidential way. So it's not to say as if the 5G toolbox is sitting on its own and it's a sort of a purely voluntary approach. No, it's sitting on that well-established primary law that exists and the enforcement abilities that exists in the member states.
Thank you. And what we're seeing as a result of that, if we look across the map that the three of you who come from government represent, is a set of decisions taken sometimes quite prescriptively on the basis of government legislation or regulation, sometimes as a result of the kind of risk analysis you've just described, Piers, which is leading to the complete or partial exclusion of some vendors from network builds, I think right across the geography we're representing. Is there a risk there that this is starting to create a vendor-based, a hardware-based division between Europe and the United States and other parts of the world? Is the risk of the splinter net starting to become reality partly as a result of these decisions?
So I can kick off on that one. And as I mentioned before, we are just fully supportive of the incumbent suppliers based in Europe and beyond who will be building out our 5G networks in the United States, but looking towards the diversification piece as well and encouraging the new actors where we see an open marketplace, not a splinter net, the chance for operators to really have choice across the spectrum.
Scott.
I'm at risk of violently agreeing with Jasha, but I suppose the only point I would add, and I always reinforce this, is as you say, Matthew, I think countries all over the world are taking their own particular decisions about their risk tolerance and their willingness or otherwise to have high-risk vendors supply into their networks. But actually, the point that I say over and over again is kind of almost irregardless of the particular decisions that countries are taking, like it shouldn't be satisfactory for us globally to have so few vendors. And that, for me, is a kind of, it's why everyone needs to take action. It sort of doesn't matter if you're particularly wanting to constrain or otherwise high-risk vendors. It's not satisfactory globally for us to have so few to have such a little choice of vendors. So it's something that I think all countries and industry should be embracing.
Diane, could I address a question to you as representing the Open RAN Policy Coalition? Clearly, that sort of vision of a global ability to connect whatever it is you develop into network architecture, that needs to link to the way in which standards have traditionally been developed, and very much an industry-led process there. We're seeing maybe a little bit of fragmentation in the standard setting scene at the moment. Are you trying to push against that? Are you trying to establish something new? How do you see this being taken forward?
Sure. So I would say that participation at standards bodies is incredibly important. It's important that we work with our allies around the world to ensure that we are putting forward standards that are going to help not only industry, but help networks. I know there's been a lot of consternation in governments around the world about what happens at standards bodies. At the Open RAN Policy Coalition, we do a lot of educating what is discussed and what is not discussed. I think there's sometimes this little misunderstanding that you are discussing the secret sauce and that could get in the wrong hands. And you are standing next to your partners, you're standing next to your competitors, that what is being discussed is a common standard so you can all operate and interoperate and scale, and that is incredibly important. It is incredibly important for companies to be able to sell into other parts of the world, and so we need to keep these lines of communication open. Private industry wants to work with government wants to work with private industry to figure out how to best move forward in these situations, but it's incredibly important that we do not splinter from that. And I would say that foreign adversaries are looking to move away from that because they see a benefit in going it on their own. We want to make sure that we can kind of coalesce and keep these standards bodies moving into productive activity.
So a hugely important role for maintaining a global approach to standards overall. Did any of you want to pick up on that? I see vigorous nodding from everyone, so I'll take that as agreement. Well, look, we're getting towards the end of our time. I have a last question for each of you, which is just to look a little bit, this is very much an event which is about the future, look a little bit into the future and take maybe a minute each to tell us what you think the telecom supply chain of the future looks like. And we'll start from this end first this time. So, Scott, you have time to think about your answer.
Very happy to kick off on this. The United States really sees a future where open networks are widespread, and we see this open architecture, enhanced market competition, a world where there's a plethora of suppliers to choose from. And what we are doing now to get there is testing, looking at the security, looking at the tough questions to do what we can from the government approach to enable industry's development. Something that I'm very eagerly watching is something called the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund, which our Congress is considering now, which would appropriate my agency $1.5 billion to accelerate this transition towards open architectures. And so it's this role of government to help this momentum that's already started move along to create this open future that we see happening.
Diane.
Thanks, Jaysha. So I'm not an engineer. I'm a policy person. But I will say that if it was 2002 instead of 2022 when we were talking about future-proof, we'd all be standing on a pile of copper right now. We need to ensure that our networks are open to allow for innovation to continue. If we want the network of the future, we need to start creating the architecture to ensure that happens.
Thank you. Yeah, it is important that we end by looking in the future. And it is clear that with 6G coming, the future is very exciting. We do all agree it has to be based on global standards which ensure security, which also, by the way, meet our climate needs, which we must never forget. That is another sort of entry cost that we must impose on ourselves. But just to get to the heart of the question, we see virtualization and openness being key, but we will insist that that is for the entire value chain. So just as we've heard about two suppliers not being acceptable for governments, it is clear that, for example, as we look more and more at Cloud Edge and Cloud RAN, that where we have three hyperscalers who dominate that market, that's not acceptable either, particularly as they could actually overtake telcos and then have total virtual integration, which is, from a market's point of view as well as a security point of view, not appropriate. Thirdly, then, is the chips piece, where we all have to contribute, because Europe's vocation is not to dominate the market, it's to go from 10% to 20% of production to ensure global supply in what will be increasing demand. And the last point across all of this value chain, if we are serious about being open, then it has to be open source. Obviously with the security controls that we know need to be introduced, but it is open source, because if software is the way of designing networks, then the barrier to entry will be hugely lowered if we follow the open source path. And then we will have much greater diversity, much easier market entry on the basis of certified security standards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe it's that. Oh, I was doing so well. Sorry, can you hear me? No. Is that okay? Yeah. I was about to say maybe it's actually worse going last because everyone's now said everything I was going to say. I mean, I'll keep it short. I think diverse, even more innovative, competitive, secure by default. Those are kind of all features that are really critical for us. I suppose the one kind of point I would make is we've set out from the UK's perspective where we want to get to in terms of kind of the amount of openness in our networks in the kind of foreseeable future, and we've set out an ambition to have 35% of network traffic operating across open and interoperable sites by 2030. That's a joint ambition with our operators. And I raise that partly because I suppose it sort of talks to this point that there's going to be a mixed mode. There's going to be things bumping alongside each other. We don't sort of see a world in which everything is open and interoperable and there's Open RAN everywhere, but that we see it as kind of being a really critical and sort of ultimately self-sustaining part of our network and other networks going forward.
Well, thank you very much to all four of you. And could I ask you all, that's come to the end of our panel session, to join me in saying warm thanks to Jaysha, Diane, Piers, and Scott. Thank you very much.